Ayhan Kaya'da neoliberal düzlemde güvenlik söyleminin yapı bozumu ve ötekiler üzerine bir sunum yapacak.
Bu güvenlik söyleminin nasıl inşa edildiğini, özellikle Batı'da nasıl inşa edildiğini ve nelerin üstünü aslında örtmek için ideolojik amaçlarla kullanılan bir yönetsellik aygıtı olduğunu, bir yönetsellik aracı olduğunu anlatmaya çalışacağım. So during the Cold War period, the notion of security used to be defined in political and military terms as the protection of a state's boundaries, its integrity, and its values against the dangers of a hostile international arena. But nowadays, security concerns are not only reduced to protecting states against ideological and military threats, they are also related to issues such as migration, ethnic revival, religious revival, environmental problems, identity claims, and sometimes supranational entities such as the European Union. Lately, migration has been presented in the Western public space as a security threat that must be dealt with. One could argue that modern states tend to extend the fear of migrants and others by categorizing, stigmatizing, statisticalizing, and coupling migration together with major problems such as unemployment, violence, crime, insecurity, drug trafficking, and human smuggling. This tendency is reinforced by the use of racist and xenophobic terminology that dehumanizes migrants and others. One can see this racist and dehumanizing tone in various terms popularly used in everyday life, such as influx of immigrants, invasion of immigrants, the country is flooded with immigrants, and intrusion of immigrants. These are also the notions, the concepts that we're also using from time to time without actually realizing what they connote. Issues such as migration, poverty, isolation have recently become security issues through a process of social construction, namely securitization, as the main rationale of the security discourse seems to have shifted from protecting the state to protecting society. Protection of society against any kind of evil has become the pillar of the security discourse in a way that popularized the term security. The securitization of migration, or in other words, stigmatization of migrants, became a vital issue, especially after September 11 attacks in the United States and elsewhere. Notably, after Madrid 2004, London 2005, bombings, and recently there is also a kind of similar pattern or process resulting from the threats of the Islamic State, ISIS, leading to the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris, and also to the Pegida movement in Germany. Much of the response to these attacks has focused on immigration issues, although the perpetrators of the bombings were mostly products of the society they attacked. The so-called homeborn terrorists or homegrown terrorists were even coined to underline the fact that they were mostly the products of the societies they attacked. The categorization of those responsible as migrants through the security discourse seems to be a systematic attempt to externalize the structural failures produced by the so-called neoliberal social political structure. The security discourse conceals, I believe, the fact that ethno-religious claims of migrants and their reluctance to integrate actually result from existing structural problems of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, xenophobia, heterophobia, nationalism, and racism. To put it differently, the public perception of migration as the principal source of present disorder masks the actual causes of the globalized social political discontent. It is likely that modern states tend to employ the discourse of securitization as a political technique that can integrate a society politically by staging a convincing existential threat in the form of an internal or even an external enemy, an enemy that is created by security agencies by categorizing and stigmatizing migration together with drug trafficking, human trafficking, violence, criminality, etc. Recent research on securitization of migration rightfully draws our attention to the fact that at the official level, modern state institutions address only an insignificant correlation between undocumented migration and the problems of global poverty, debt, health, and employment issues fostered by the neoliberal political economy. The issue of the illegal migrants, for instance, has lately been picked up by the populist right-wing extremist political elite and state administrations in the West as the very source of endemic problems such as unemployment and poverty. On the other hand, anti-illegal immigration activity operates as a technology of anti-citizenship, portraying those to be excluded from citizenry, and implies crucial issues of belonging, identity, inclusion, and exclusion. It has become a popular sport for the neoliberal states to address the following groups as anti-citizens to be excluded from political, social, economic, and even cultural resources. Petty criminals, muggers, prostitutes, pimps, the homeless, gang members, drug offenders, murderers, illegal migrants, refugees, the Roma, and the like. The archetype of this anti-citizen is the North African, let's say in France, the Turkish in Germany, Belgium, or the Netherlands, and African American or Latino in the United States. In this regard, one could argue that both securitization of migration and anti-illegal immigration activities, techniques and programs serve as a form of governmentality in Foucauldian terms in the interest of the political authority. Governmentality here refers to the practices which characterize the form of supervision of a state exercising over its subjects, their wealth, misfortunes, customs, bodies, souls, and habits. Well, given the importance of regional cooperation in migration control, it's also worth briefly considering how the linkage between migration and terrorism was treated in the political rhetoric of at the EU level. The problem actually lies in the very nature of the EU, which is gradually becoming more like a territorial state over the last 20 years. In this regard, for instance, maps, media images, and statistics become influential among several others, influential ideological tools contributing to the production of a sterile European space free of others who are ethnoculturally and religiously different. For instance, maps, let me just here, maps displaying the roads undertaken by illegal migrants to get into the EU have been employed as ideological tools in order to territorialize the European space in a way that permits European subjects to internalize territorial Europe easily. Maps can also frame others as enemies. This is the most cunning and radical version of what Slavoj Žižek calls ultra-politics, which is an attempt to depoliticize conflict by way of bringing it into an extreme, by way of reformulating it as a war between us and them, our enemy, where there is no common ground for symbolic conflict. What is the difference between this map and the other map? The former displays the east, west, and south-north migration routes, while the latter shows the movement of armed forces during the World War II. Both maps present the direction of threats coming from somewhere and heading for another destination. Migrants and armed forces are perceived as identical challenges in the imagery of individuals. In other words, maps make objects visible. The map makers are engaged in a process of manipulation rather than objective and faithful representation. Then maps certainly offer powerful evidence of an ideologically motivated reorganization of geographical space. Maps are ideological installations. On the one hand, they portray accumulated modern understanding of how the world should be represented, such as the Arctic is on the top and Antarctica is on the bottom. But they also portray more specific ideological or cultural narratives. For instance, for European students, the maps they have on their walls of their classrooms with the Europe front and center are correct maps. These maps lead Europeans to construct an ethnocentric perspective. We have the same map in Turkey, by the way, locating Europe in the very center of the world. On the contrary, the maps that Japanese students draw have Japan front and center. I don't know if it is. This is Australian now, actually. So what I'm saying is that, you know, maps are very ethnocentric constructions, ideological constructions. They are lies, they are nothing but lies, basically. Similarly, the dominant regimes of representation are formed in a way that migrant groups or their descendants are stereotypically perceived and represented by the majority media. This is one of the most critical issues that needs to be addressed, of course. But I will leave it to you, as I have limited time, to address some other important issues. The process of othering of migrants in public imagery is also evident in statisticalizing of illegal immigrants through the use of a variety of numerical technologies such as statistics, population surveys, counts, demographic trends, economic forecasts, and the like. Statistical data on illegal migrants usually draws security forces' attention to refugees and asylum seekers originating from third world countries who often travel in those boats and trucks that have become indispensable schemes in our daily news media. However, there have recently been some studies that have examined and decoded some of this data, and they reveal that most of the so-called illegal immigrants are not actually those boat people that you see in Australia or in the UK or the United States, or truck people that you see in Turkey, suffering from inhuman conditions. Instead, the figures actually hide overstayers who go on staying in countries even after their visas expire. The Polish plumber issue in France on the eve of the European constitutional referendum in 2005, the French Society of Plumbers revealed that the total number of plumbers of Polish origin in France was only 140. So there was no need to make a big fuss about the number of Polish immigrants, Polish plumbers, which is also an ideological construct. And one should also recognize that modern times make it possible that British or German plumbers prefer to operate in the Spanish or Turkish Riviera. That is also the case in Turkey. We have British plumbers in Antalya. I've seen them myself. I've made research with them. So stereotypically casting migration and emphasizing its disruptive consequences, the media also plays a role in the securitization process of migration. So, conclusion. To reiterate, to conclude, migration has recently been framed as a source of fear and instability for the nation states in the West. Yet, not long ago, it was rather a source of contentment and happiness in the 1960s. Several different reasons, like deindustrialization, changing technology, unemployment, poverty, and neoliberal political economy, can be mentioned to explicate the reasons of such a discontent. Furthermore, the enormous demographic change caused by the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc should not be underestimated either. The period starting in 1989 signifies the beginning of a new historical epoch, leading to massive migration of ethnic Germans, ethnic Hungarians, ethnic Russians, and Russian Jews from one place to another. Demobilization of millions of people stimulated nation-state to change their migration policies in a way that encouraged the arrival of immigrants from similar ethnic backgrounds. This period of demographic change in Western Europe went in tandem with the rise of discourses such as the clash of civilizations, culture wars, Islamophobia that presented societal heterogeneity in an unfavorable light. The intensification of Islamophobia, for instance, was made easier by Al-Qaeda-type violence and the radicalization of some segments of Muslim origin immigrant communities in Central in several countries reinforced the societal unrest resulting from immigration. The result was the introduction of restrictive migration policies and increased territorial border security vis-à-vis the nationals of third countries who originated from outside the European continent. However, keeping in mind that demographic deficit and migration in the European countries are now becoming the realities of everyday life, one could conclude that such a migrant-phobic attitude is not really sustainable. So there are already some positive signs, I believe, coming from France, Germany, and Spain. France, because François Hollande and the French officials were very careful in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo massacre in using a very cohesive political discourse in order not to bash Islam in a way that was very different from former Sarkozy administration. Similarly, Angela Merkel and the German state officials are also very careful in picking up their side with the anti-Pegida movement, denouncing the rise of populist racist discourse against Islam, migrants, and the Turks in particular. And finally, a very interesting move just recently came from the Spanish state, which officially decided to withdraw from the initiative of Alliance of Civilizations, coordinated together with Turkey under the UN umbrella since 2005. Let me conclude saying that I'm now more inclined to believe that culturalist, religious, and civilizational rhetoric, which has been very popular since the 1990s, specifically since the birth of the Huntingtonian paradigm of clash of civilizations, is now coming to an end, and a societal, a social, economic, and political discourse is going to precede the Western world, at least. That's my conclusion. Thank you very much.